This video is going to teach how to play the third game of the Space Piracy campaign. This game is called Smuggle the Goods. To set the game up, start by taking all of the face cards from the deck and set those aside for now. Then you'll want to build the player deck by taking the ace through 10 of hearts and shuffling this. Set this near the player face down. Next, you'll want to prepare the enemy deck. The enemy deck consists of the 2 through 10 of diamonds. Go ahead and shuffle that and place this off to the side for now. You also want to take the ace of diamonds and 1 joker and set that near the enemy deck. The other joker will not be used for this game. You can also remove the ace of clubs and the ace of spades from the game unless you're playing through the campaign, in which there may be a situation where you get to add these into the player deck. Take the remaining cards and form the facilities deck. The facilities deck should consist of the 2 through 10 of clubs and spades. Go ahead and shuffle this deck. After shuffling this deck, you will use the cards to create a 3x3 grid in the play area. The remaining cards will go off to the side for now. They will be used later to refill any spots that become empty in the 3x3 grid. Find all of the spade and club face cards and separate those out. You can set the other ones to the side for now. Shuffle these cards, and then we're going to randomly place them along the left and top border of the 3x3 grid. Then take the diamond face cards, shuffle those, and place those along the right side of the grid. Then set the king, queen, and jack of hearts somewhere near the enemy deck. These cards will be used to track how much time is remaining before the game ends. Now it's time to determine the starting position of the player ship, which is represented by the joker, and the enemy ship, which is represented by the ace of diamonds. You'll always start with the player ship. To determine the location, you want to first flip over the top card of the enemy deck. In this case, it's the 8. Then you'll want to count to the 8th position in the 3x3 grid. You start in the top left and go across the row until reaching the end, and then you continue counting in the next row, left to right, and so on. So in this case, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the starting position for the player ship. Next, before you determine the starting position for the enemy ship must first know its objective. The enemy ship's objective is the 9 of diamonds. You draw the top card from the enemy deck and place it horizontally to the left in order to give the enemy ship its objective. Then you can determine the placement of the enemy ship. So draw the next top card from the enemy deck, place that in the enemy discard to the right, and then count out the number of positions represented by that card. Since there is no ace in this deck, because the ace is represented by the enemy ship, the 10 actually serves as the 1. And that's easy to remember, because if you were to count all the way through and you would get to 9, 10 would start you back over in the first position. Or you can simply remember that the 10 always represents the first space in the grid. And so I would place the enemy ship there. After completing the ship placements, the game is fully set up and ready to be played. The object of this game is to smuggle as many of these cards as you can from the 3x3 grid and deliver them to the appropriate monarch along the left and top border. You can never make any deliveries to the diamonds. The face card diamonds are the enemy, just like the ace of diamond represents the enemy ship. So you can never move on to these spaces, but you can move on to the face card spaces if they are club or spade. While you are attempting to make your deliveries, enemy ship will also be moving around, trying to make their own deliveries to their face cards on the right side, and they also may attack you at times. This game is played over a series of rounds. Each round consists of 3 phases. The first phase is the player phase, followed by the enemy phase, and then finally the ship placement phase. The player phase always begins by drawing from the player deck until you have 5 cards in hand. The player then gets to take actions by playing cards from their hand to their discard pile. The player phase ends once the player runs out of cards to play from their hand or chooses to no longer play any cards from their hand. It's important to note that the player does not get to discard their hand at the end of their turn. Whatever cards they choose not to play will stay in their hand until the start of the next turn, where they will just draw up until they have a total of 5 cards. The first player action I'll go over is movement. So the player can move their ship 1 space up or down by playing an odd card from their hand to their discard pile. So in this scenario, I could play a 5 to move my ship up 1 space. The player can move left or right by playing an even card from their hand to their discard pile. So in this scenario, I can move left 1 space. As mentioned previously, I can never move onto one of the diamond face cards. However, I can move onto any of the spade or club face cards. When I'm on one of those face cards, I can never move directly to another face card. I must first enter the grid and then perform movement to move onto the intended destination. If the player or enemy ship ever move from a space and that space that was just moved from no longer has any cards in that space, you then take a card from the top of the facilities deck and refill that space. If the facilities deck is ever empty, you just leave that space empty. You can still move into that space, and you'll just want to use the face cards to help you make sense of where those spaces are. So in a situation where there are multiple cards in the grid missing, you can still move to those empty spaces as normal, paying the normal price to do so. It's important to note that whenever performing movement, a player can play more than 1 card to perform that movement. This can be beneficial whenever you need to try to get to an odd number in order to move up and down, or to get to an even number in order to move left or right. So if my hand consisted of just these 2 cards, and I really wanted to move up, but I also didn't want the 6 to still be in my hand at the end of the turn, I could play both of these cards to move up 1 space because 7 is an odd number. Also, if I had just these 2 cards in my hand, the 7 and the 1, and I wanted to move left or right, I could play both of those because that would be a total value of 8, which is even. Now I'll cover the second action that a player can take. That action is gaining a new card. A player can gain a new card by playing any number of cards from their hand such that the total value of those cards is greater than the value on the card of their current location. So if I wanted to gain this 5 of clubs, I couldn't just play the 5 to my discard pile. Instead, I would have to at least pay 6, and then with this hand of cards, the most efficient way to do so would be to play the 5 and 2. Once I've spent those cards or played those cards to my discard pile, I can then take this card from under my location and I can add that card to my discard pile. It's important to note that if you ever need to draw cards and your player deck is empty, you take your discard pile, shuffle it up, and then draw your hand from the newly shuffled deck. In this way, you'll be able to eventually access the cards that you are purchasing from the 3x3 grid. The next player action I'll go over is how to perform a delivery. So let's say that I had at some point purchased this 5 of clubs and it's in my hand at the start of my turn. I could potentially deliver this card. Now, in order to deliver one of the cards you've purchased out here, and you can only deliver cards that were purchased out here. I can't, for instance, deliver a heart because of the rules I'm getting ready to describe. In order to deliver a card, you must make it to a face card that matches that suit, and then based on the value or the rank of that card, you have to be at a particular face card. The jacks, the jack of clubs and the jack of spades, can only receive the 2, 3s, and 4s from the grid. The queens can receive the 5, 6, and 7s, and the kings can receive the 8s, 9s, and 10s. But as mentioned, it has to be the correct suit. So at the start of my turn, if I was in this location and I had the 5 in my hand, I could move twice to this queen, and I would just need to play 2 even cards to do that. So I'd play maybe a 4 to move 1 space to the left. This spot would then be empty, so I would have to refill it from the facilities deck. Then I could play another card to move left again. And then I could play this card from my hand directly underneath the card I'm making the delivery at. And remember, the queens want to receive the 5s, 6s, and 7s. And they have to be the same suit. So I could then place that card there. That card is removed from my deck, but that card will score me points at the end of the game. Only the cards underneath the spade and club face cards give you points at the end of the game. Cards in your deck do not give you points. The final action a player can take is attacking the enemy ship. To attack the enemy ship, you would first need to move into the same space as the enemy ship. So in this scenario, I could play an odd card to move up 1 space. And then the moment you enter the same space as an enemy card, you must play an ace to win the combat. The aces in your deck or in your hand are the only cards that allow you to successfully win a combat. But you only need one of them, and you can just play it straight to your discard pile. When you defeat the enemy, they get removed from the board until the ship placement phase, which comes after the enemy phase. So by doing this, you can buy some time away from the enemy. If the player ever enters the same space as the enemy ship, and the player does not have an ace in their hand, they instead get removed from the player board until the ship placement phase. This can drastically hinder your ability to score points. In addition to being removed for a period of time, you also have to turn one of your time tracking cards face down. If at any time you are required to turn one of the time tracking cards face down, but they all are already face down, then the game immediately ends and you go to scoring. So by getting your ship removed from the board, this can really hamper your ability to get a high score in this game. Now it's time to go over the enemy phase. The enemy phase always begins with flipping over the top card of the enemy deck and placing it into the enemy discard pile. That even occurs if the enemy is currently not on the board. So in the situation where the player has moved and knocked the enemy ship off the board for the remainder of that round, at the start of the enemy phase, you would flip over the card from the top of the enemy deck into the discard pile and then move on to ship placement. That would be the entire enemy's turn. But you always must flip over one of the cards from the top of the enemy deck. At the beginning of the enemy phase, when it's time to flip over the top card of the enemy deck, if the enemy deck is empty, you must first flip down one of your time tracking cards, and then you shuffle the deck and flip over the top card and continue playing. Again, if you're in a situation where you have to flip over one of your face-up time tracking cards and none of them are face-up, the game ends immediately and you go to scoring. Important to note that the card that was flipped over at the beginning of the enemy phase round will often be referenced multiple times throughout the enemy phase. So let's talk about what the enemy ship actually does on its turn. So after you have flipped over, in this case, the 4 of diamonds from the enemy deck, you check to see if the enemy ship has an objective card on the board. So the objective card is the 9 of diamonds. The suit doesn't matter on the objective card. The only thing that matters is the number. So the enemy ship will check to see if there is a 9 somewhere on the game board, which there is. Then the enemy ship will perform a number of movements toward their objective. Since the 4 was flipped over, they will move 1 space. The rule for the standard settings of this game is that if the value of the flipped over card is 5 or less, the enemy will only move 1 space. But if it is 6 or more, then the enemy will move 2 spaces. The enemy will then perform a check to see if that card is in either its column or row, which in this scenario it's in its row, and then it will move the number of spaces denoted by the card flipped over at the beginning of the round towards that card. So in this case, it's only 1 movement and it will move 1 space toward the 9. If the 7 had been flipped over, since that is greater than 5, the enemy would move 2 spaces toward that card to try to complete its objective. The moment that the enemy ship enters the space with a card matching its objective, the card actually gets placed on top of the enemy ship. If the enemy ship's objective is not in the column or row, the enemy will move toward its card. The way you break ties is by checking the card that was flipped over at the beginning of the round. If that card is odd, the enemy will prioritize moving up or down first before moving left or right. So in this situation, the tie is broken here because this is an odd card. So instead of going left or right first, it's going to go up or down first. After completing 1 movement, it will then check to see if it has more movement, and if it does, it will then just repeat the same check. Is the objective card in the row or column? Yes, it is. So it would then move towards that card. And again, the moment it enters that space, it gets to pick up that card. When the enemy ship is trying to determine whether or not it has an objective on the board, and it finds that there is no card matching this value on the board, the objective becomes the player's ship. So the enemy ship will perform movement towards the player's ship following all the rules already described. Once the enemy ship has picked up its objective card, it's then going to make a delivery. It's then going to try to deliver that card. So the objective changes to whichever face card correlates with this value of card. And again, suits don't matter for the enemy ship. So it has this 9 of spades, which you can tell because it's on top of the enemy ship. So its objective is going to be the king, because remember, jacks want 2, 3s, and 4s, queens want 5, 6, and 7s, and kings want 8s, 9s, and 10s. So if it were the start of the round and we flipped a 7, the enemy would have 2 movement, which would allow it to move once, and then this spot would be open, so we'd have to fill it in, and then it would check again. It knows its king is in its row, so it would move one more time, and then the moment that the ship reaches a face card with its delivery, you take the delivery card, place it underneath the face card, and then set the enemy ship off to the side until the ship placement phase. So this behaves very similarly to how you perform your deliveries. During the enemy phase, if the enemy ship is able to move into the same space as the player, you must immediately perform a combat. And the rules are the exact same. So remember, at the end of the player phase, you do not get to draw up to 5 cards. That is only at the very beginning of the player phase. So, if you think that you might be attacked on your turn, you'll definitely want to make sure that you try to keep an ace in your hand. If you have an ace in your hand when the enemy ship enters your space, you just play that ace to your discard pile immediately, and you will win that combat, sending the enemy ship off the board. However, if you don't have an ace in your hand, so if I only had the 7, then I would lose that combat, or the player would lose that combat, and the player ship would be sent off of the board. I'd also like to mention here that if at any point the enemy ship has a card in its possession, shown by the card being on top of the ace, and the player wins a combat at that location, the player actually gets to steal that card, place it into their discard, and still send the enemy off the game board. I would like to point out an edge case with enemy movement. If the enemy's it has 2 objectives on the board, and they're equidistant from the enemy ship, and the check to see if the enemy is prioritizing up or down, left or right, doesn't matter because they're in the middle and they could either go up or down, then the player gets to decide which way the ship goes, unless there is a clear beneficial path for the enemy ship. So, for instance, in this scenario, it doesn't matter if the ship goes up or down, because the next place the ship is going to be heading is still going to be equidistant in either of those options, which would be the king here. So if it went up here, it still has to go 3 spaces. If it went down here, it still has to go 3 spaces. That doesn't matter. But if these cards were switched, the enemy ship would then have fewer spaces after picking up the card to travel if it went down first than if it went up. So in that scenario, the enemy ship would prioritize going here because these cards never move, so you know that it would always be trying to go here next, and so it would go down. But that is the only time the player can make a decision about the enemy ship. It's when there's no clear optimal choice between the 2 options. Now it's time to talk about the final phase of the round, which is the ship placement phase. At the start of this phase, if both ships are on the board currently, then skip this phase. If the player ship is not on the board, then the player must flip over one of the cards from the enemy deck, then use the same counting system that you used during setup to place the player ship. So I flipped the 2, so it'd be right here. If the enemy ship is off the board at the start of the ship placement phase, then the first thing you want to do is discard the objective card. Then replace the objective card with a new one, and then draw a card to place the enemy ship. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Remember, if you have to reshuffle the enemy deck, flip over one of the time tracking cards. That's really important. Also, remember, any time that the two ships enter the same space, a combat must be performed. So, it is possible to be in the 6th position, and then when it's time to place the enemy ship, you could draw these 6 from the enemy deck, and then they would enter your space, and if you do not have an ace in your hand, you would actually be knocked out for that round. So whenever you're deciding when to attack, always take into consideration by looking at the discard pile what the odds are of them re-entering and basically counterattacking you during the ship placement phase. And of course, this can play out the other way where you enter their space during the ship placement phase and you would still perform the combat like normal. As mentioned previously, the game ends if the player is ever required to turn a time tracking card face down, but they are all already face down. Once the game has ended, you can find your total score for the game by collecting all of the cards that are underneath the club and spade face cards. So collect all of those, add those together, and then subtract the total value of all of the cards underneath the enemy face cards. That difference is your total score for the game.